Hello, my name is Dr. Daniel Barnett. I'm an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering, where I hold a joint appointment in the Department of Health Policy and Management. I'm the principal investigator for the Mid-Atlantic Regional Public Health Training Center, Johns Hopkins Local Performance Site, and I'm very pleased to be delivering this presentation for the OHCQ Leadership Development Series on managing multiple priorities and projects. I would respectfully suggest that this is one of the most challenging things that we do in any kind of workplace. And at a busy place like Office for Healthcare Quality, juggling multiple priorities and projects can be particularly challenging. Today I'm going to present very practical, applied suggestions and tools that you can implement to enhance your efficiency and effectiveness in your respective roles. First, I'd like to begin with a discussion of the relationship between self-management and priority management. Being an effective and efficient worker at a busy institution like OHCQ requires balancing your personal priorities and your workplace priorities. We'll be discussing that in the context of this presentation. I'd like to list some common priority management problems that are true of any organization, and I'll be curious as you hear this list to see how this resonates with your experience at OHCQ. Insufficient planning, conflicting, multiple, or shifting priorities, telephone interruptions, no one ever gets those, right? Drop-in visitors, attempting to do too much, lack of clear goals, no daily plan, perfectionism, you may have heard the expression, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or paralysis by analysis. Those both relate to perfectionism. Personal disorganization, indecision, crisis management, and ineffective delegation. Now, some or all of these may apply to your personal experiences, but whether they all apply or only some of them apply, I hope that you'll find the tips and tools that I discussed today to be relevant to address some of the challenges that you may encounter in your day-to-day work at OHCQ. One other item I'd like to mention as a continuation of the last list is deadlines. Deadlines are one of the biggest challenges that we face in any workflow environment, and sometimes deadlines are realistic or they may be unrealistic, but it's something that we're going to talk about in the context of your workflow and highlighting how you can become more efficient in addressing it. The last item on this slide is low priority work. Later on, we'll be talking about the 80-20 rule, and we'll talk about how we can optimize the time that we spend at work to accomplish the most and the most important types of deliverables. This is just an example of how you can chart your work through a daily log. I highly recommend that you consider putting one together that works for you, respectively, because this can allow you to basically get an insight into your workflow as an individual employee of the Office of Healthcare Quality. And it can also allow you to do a look-back analysis to see how your efficiency may be improving or not over time. Let's get real about time management. We all have too many things to do during our workday, and OHCQ is certainly no exception to that. These are some frequent thoughts and concerns that commonly crop up in any work environment, and I'm sure are relevant to yours. If only I had more time, or I can save time. Here's a common one. The harder and longer I work, the more I will accomplish. In other words, working harder equals working smarter. That's a misconception. Or, related to that last statement, to be more productive, I need to work harder. Well, hard work is a given, but smart work is essential, and we'll talk about that. There are 4 basic questions that we need to consider when addressing the challenges of dealing with multiple priorities and projects at OHCQ or any workplace environment. What has to be done? How much of it has to be done? How fast does it have to be done? And how much does it cost to do it? Now, depending on your role in leadership, that last item may be more or less germane, but certainly, regardless of your role, the first 3 questions are absolutely relevant to everything that you do in one way or another at OHCQ. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was famous for the following paraphrase quote, "Nothing that is urgent is important, and nothing that is important is urgent." How many of you have received emails labeled urgent? Well, we often see those in subject lines, but Eisenhower had a different definition of urgency, and I'm going to walk you through briefly this 2x2 table, which is now referred to as the Eisenhower decision matrix. Let's look at the upper left cell. Items that are urgent and important, according to Eisenhower, include a crying baby, a kitchen fire, and some phone calls. So those are things that need to be attended to immediately and personally. In the upper right column, that's highlighted in yellow, are elements that are not urgent but are important. These include exercise, vocation, in other words, your work, and planning, which is an important part of what you do at OHCQ. In the lower left cell, we have elements that are not important but urgent, potentially. These can include interruptions, distractions, and other calls. These are kinds of activities in this lower left cell that can be delegated. And last but not least, the lower right cell are items that are not important and not urgent. According to Eisenhower, these include, for example, trivia, busy work, and time wasters. These can be discarded altogether to the extent possible because they're really unnecessary interrupters of your workday. So this is a useful 2x2 table because it can help you compartmentalize what you do as individual employees of OHCQ in the context of importance and urgency, or lack thereof, and can help you prioritize accordingly. Much of your work will fall in the upper right cell, and these are the kinds of things that are important to handle on a personal level and should take priority. And obviously anything that's important and urgent needs to be handled at a personal level and handled immediately. Let's talk about the distinction between efficiency versus effectiveness. It's possible to be efficient and effective. It's possible to be efficient and not effective. And it's also possible to be effective and not efficient. So understanding these distinctions is really important in the context of your work at OHCQ. So Peter Drucker, who has done very important work in this realm, defines efficiency as doing things right. And he defines effectiveness as doing the right things. Now those are very different. You can technically be very efficient and do things correctly, but maybe those correct things don't really add much to your workflow. Maybe they're time wasters, maybe they're extraneous. So doing things right by themselves is insufficient. Really, effectiveness is the key. Doing the right things, and of course doing them efficiently, is what we want. So let's parse this down and break it down a little more. Efficiency includes getting things done correctly, focusing on the how of doing things. So focusing on the how of doing things is a very process-oriented activity. Doing things smoothly and without fuss, not wasting motions, and exerting minimum expenditure. That doesn't mean laziness, that just means doing things smoothly and as effortlessly as possible while still being efficient. Now there are elements, obviously, of your workflow at OHCQ that fall under this description. Any kind of process that is ingrained in regulatory activities and interface with stakeholders or clients that has to be done a certain way falls under the rubric of efficiency. Efficiency elements are very important to acknowledge, but as I mentioned earlier, effectiveness is actually the most important. And that's illustrated here on this slide. So effectiveness elements include getting the right things done correctly at the right time. Notice the emphasis on getting the right things done and the timeliness of it in that bullet. Focusing on the why of doing things. Maybe you're doing things but haven't considered the why behind them. That's very important. Concentrating on results and achieving goals, and ultimately producing an impact. What is the outcome of your efforts? Now, as leaders at OHCQ, this is a list of very relevant considerations, because there may be workflow elements that you might revisit or consider revisiting and realize that really this is not a good use of time, or it constitutes a checklist, but it maybe isn't the right checklist. I'm just speaking hypothetically. Now, there may be elements in terms of legal statutes and other things that you simply have to adhere to, but to the extent possible, it's important to assess effectiveness in your respective workflow and at your agency level workflow. Let's talk about the 80-20 rule, which I mentioned earlier. So, an economist from Italy several centuries ago developed, his name was Pareto, developed a concept by which he identified that 20% of individuals in Italy owned 80% of the land and wealth. This actually has relevance to workflow considerations, because 20% of your time and effort in your workplace at OHCQ actually produces 80% of the output. So it's really important to focus on the 20% of the work that generates that 80% of the output as your highest priority. The remaining 80% of your work produces 20%, the remaining 20% of your output. So again, focusing on the 20% that yields the 80% of the output is critical. How can we assess what our 20% is that yields the 80% of the output? Keeping a time log, as I mentioned earlier, listing your most important tasks to be completed for the day. Record how you spend your time during the day. Analyze the priority of each of your actions and analyze how your time could be better spent in the future. So this involves careful self-analysis and reflection, and actually can be the discussion of team meetings, because individual experiences with regard to workflow can be assessed at a team level to see how your agency can become more efficient and effective. This is just an example of a time log record. I'm not stipulating what your time log should look like, but this is an example that you may want to consider, highlighting the time of day, description of activity, the importance, is it important or is it urgent based on the Eisenhower matrix, and are there interruptions, and of what type are the interruptions. It may seem tedious to create a time log, but if you do this for a 2-week span or even a 1-week span, you can get a really nice snapshot of how you work at present, and it gives you a basis for revising and enhancing your efficiency and effectiveness accordingly. You'll recall that planning was in the upper right cell of the Eisenhower matrix. Planning is very important, and as leaders at OHCQ, planning is critical, as you know. So these are elements of effective planning and why planning is so important. Planning makes things happen. Planning promotes job and career advancement. Planning actually makes decision-making easier. It reduces crises. It gives direction to the high energy that you bring to your work, of course, and it adds to the time available to do things. So actually, doing advanced planning ultimately improves workflow down the line. So it's worth the investment. I'm going to talk in a bit about project management versus process, but project management is a really key theme when we talk about managing multiple priorities in the workplace. Here is the definition of project management and the elements of that definition. A well-defined project has a clear goal. In other words, you know when you're done with that goal. There is a distinct endpoint. It's not some ongoing nebulous process. We often refer to the goal that I mentioned above as a deliverable. So that's a very common term that you likely use or have heard in the context of your work. And very importantly, a key element of project management is identifying how will that project get done, tracked, managed, costed, and communicated. So these are critical elements of metrically driven project management. And importantly, by whom on that last bullet. So identifying who should be respectively doing these kinds of tracking, managing, costing, and communication elements. Importantly, though, communication should be in sync among all the different participants in a given project. And that avoids confusion and problems in execution. Let's now turn to the definitional distinction between project versus process. So a process is something that has been performed many times. It has almost all of the variation eliminated, and it has very predictable outcomes and timing. You can think of an analogous example being an assembly line production of an automobile. There's little variation, or should be little variation in that. And you can probably think of many examples of your work at OHCQ that align with this definition of process. A project, in contrast, is something with which there is perhaps less experience, where unknowns are assumed and reasoned, and timing is a best guess. Now, communication is important for everything that you do at OHCQ, but when you're engaging in a project, again, per the definition at the bottom of this slide, it's really critical to ensure consistent and clear communication among all participants in the project, given the potential variability and uncertainty attached to it. Now I'd like to turn our attention to what we call the golden triangle when we talk about managing multiple priorities and projects. And those three elements, if you want to think of the 3 points of the triangle, are cost, time, and scope/quality, respectively. These are actual trade-offs, and I'll talk about that. But I will say that when you increase one of these 3 elements, it usually increases the others in turn. And when you decrease one of these elements, it usually decreases the others in turn. But there's a common saying that tell me how much you want it to charge, how much time, and the scope. Pick one and I'll tell you the other 2. So these are interdependent on each other. But these are really 3 critical elements for what we call the golden triangle of managing multiple priorities and projects. Let's talk about now the distinction of managing versus not managing. So not managing is ignoring the balance, or even worse, letting the balance be controlled in a project by someone else without the same goal in mind. That's a recipe for disaster. That's a recipe for a failed project. So the goals need to be explicit, clear, and my respectful suggestion is when in doubt, write it down. You've heard the game of telephone where person A says something to person B, who says something to person C, and by the time it reaches person D, it's a completely different message. So I encourage briefing memos or other kinds of written, clear goals that everyone can visually or otherwise appreciate. Now, the other point here is that managing is an active process. It's not just putting something down on paper. It's not just getting everyone to agree and then go off and do their thing. And it's not just waiting for the deliverable to appear. It is an ongoing, daily, or even multi-points within a given day process of management. So it's very labor and time intensive, but those inputs are essential to yield effective outputs for management. Now, let's talk about some other elements of a process. It's important to clearly define what do you want to get done and when is it done. If you don't have a clear endpoint, you'll never know whether you've achieved closure on a given item. You may have often experienced the common event where people take as long as they're given on a particular project. If you give them 6 months, they'll take 6 months. So it's important to be realistic but yet rigorous in identifying meaningful deadlines. It's important to figure all these things out before you start rather than at the end. There's an old expression of measure twice, cut once. That's very much applicable to this concept. And the famous expression, don't assume, is very apropos here. You should never assume anything about something that you're entering into with potential variability in your workflow. And importantly, you should document everything. This can allow for look-back assessment and refinement along the way. Let's talk about task lists very briefly. These are the essential skeletal elements of project management. PM is project management. So high level to low or low to high, it's important to sort of prioritize how you want to engage in this activity. Importantly, associate the respective contributing tasks to that activity with respective durations of those tasks. Set milestones and be aggressive in those milestones, but also realistic. Linking tasks to dependencies or predecessors is important. If task B is dependent on the completion of task A, that's important to know and document, for example. Think about resources in terms of both human and material resources and what resources you need to get each of those milestones accomplished, and adjusting along the way to make it work. It is very likely that in a highly variable process, you will need to adjust and make course corrections along the way. And those adjustments and course corrections, of course, need to be communicated to all stakeholders within that endeavor. A master list is very important to develop. So you want to divide the list into two categories in terms of your workflow. And this is speaking more generally. Business and personal. Everyone has personal elements of their workday and business elements of their workday. And parceling those out is critical in becoming efficient and effective in your roles at OHCQ. Listing any activity that needs to be done in the appropriate category, in other words, business versus personal, identifying priorities, again referring to the Eisenhower matrix. Calculating the pure time estimate of those respective activities can be done through a look-back analysis at the time logs that I've respectfully suggested that you create. A very psychologically satisfying activity is to move the to-do list items to the done list items. In other words, crossing them off the list. There's something very satisfying about that, and it gives you a sense of forward motion in your workday. My respectful suggestion for your to-do list is to try to the extent possible, accomplish one activity at a time. Now, multitasking is sometimes inevitable, but to the extent that you can focus your energy on one activity, you'll actually be more efficient than if you multitask and sort of spend partial attention to two activities or more at once. Accomplishing the most important results first. That's very important and also dovetails with the 80-20 rule that I mentioned earlier. Eliminating the possibility of forgetting small but important details is critical. You've heard the expression, the devil is in the details. Well, by thinking carefully about the work that you do and parceling it out based on time logs and these other considerations will allow you to forget those, or will prevent you from forgetting those critical details that could otherwise impede your effectiveness and efficiency. By the way, creating a to-do list allows you to resume work faster after you've been interrupted. We all have interruptions in our workday, but the goal is to resume work quickly after interruptions. And of course, as I mentioned, increasing your sense of satisfaction as you cross off items off your to-do list. Importantly, at the macro level, we need to think of our work, and you need to think of your work respectfully at OHCQ as pieces of a pie. So there are a whole range of things that we bring to our life, including family, friends, self, and work. And work, as you see, is just one piece of that pie. But these tools and recommendations will allow you to achieve actually a work-life balance, increasing your effectiveness at OHCQ, increasing your efficiency at OHCQ, and ultimately enhance the quality of your life in the process. Here is a slide about balancing work and home. When trying to balance work and home, remember priorities change, so you should change your focus to match. So that's very important to keep that flexibility in mind. Your to-do list or your log for a given week may not reflect your respective list or log for a year from that point in time. So I suggest that you should develop a task list and look at how your workflow is proceeding at least every quarter, once a quarter, so you can see how that may change based on your personal and other priorities. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope this has been helpful as you think about the important work that you do as leaders at OHCQ. For any questions, I can be reached at dbarnett4@jhu.edu. Thank you again.